Welcome to my new video on introductory paragraphs for literary analysis. This video includes examples from a different text than my previous one and is a little more streamlined. This video also assumes that you've already had some brainstorming or outlining work done to get ready for your essay that you're going to write and that you know where you're going with your paper. If you need help with those steps, please see my other videos about those topics for some tips. Today we will go over the literary analysis introduction paragraph and I'll share some examples with you. The writing pause points are also intended for those typing their paper and following along. If you're handwriting, simply leave yourself plenty of room or literally cut and paste your sections of the intro into the paper order when you are done. I've already done that as an activity with my students, actually, and it works really well since we write our introduction out of order. So here we go. Follow along. Pause when you need to. All right, our goals today are that you can analyze an example introduction to help you understand how to write an introduction and what are the common components, which include background information, attention getter hook, and also, of course, your thesis. For some of you, this may be a little bit of a review. For some of you, it may be new. It just depends on where you're at. So let's review the parts of an introduction first before we get into how to write one and some different techniques we can look at. Remember, introductions can vary depending on the type of writing, but in the academic setting, we tend to have these three main parts for an introduction. For most essays, you're going to need a hook or attention getter, which is related to the main topic in your thesis. That is intended to get your reader interested in what you have to write about. In the professional world, professional writers often have multiple paragraphs that could be the hook attention getter, but we're in an academic essay, so we try to keep it pretty short and condensed and to the point, usually a couple of sentences long. We then have a section of background information, which establishes what you're writing about. It gives us the full title of the piece of literature you're analyzing. That's really common. We need that so we know what you're actually talking about. The full name of the author who wrote the text that you're analyzing. A brief summary of the main plot. If it's a poem, you would still summarize the main concept of the poem and what the author is writing about. You would also, in the cases of plays and novels and short stories, include the main characters' names and maybe some major conflicts, and that's all blended into that summary. And then finally, the most important thing in our essay is our thesis, which is your main point that you're trying to make, your interpretation of the text that you're arguing. For the literary analysis essay, remember, we're writing an argument about literature. So for the background information that we write before the thesis, it needs to properly introduce the literature we're writing about so that we're aware of that going into the thesis. And don't worry, I'll give you more information on how to do this when we get to that portion of the video. This is a complete sample introduction paragraph that I will be coming back to throughout this presentation. Don't worry, I have some other examples in other portions of the video, but this is the main one we'll be looking at. If you want to read the text this one is based off, it's the short story called Clack the Rattlebag by Neil Gaiman. You can probably find a copy of it online, and it would only take you a few minutes to read it to understand it. So feel free to pause and go read that short story so you kind of have some context for what you're getting into. This paragraph will pop up throughout the presentation and is color-coded to help you understand the different portions. While an introduction does go in the order from hook to background to thesis, we often write them in a backwards order. In other words, this isn't the location they are on the page, it's the way that I actually physically write them down or think about them. Because I need to know where I'm going in order to know what to start off with. So in this video, I will take you through my example introduction and show you the parts and explain why I would write them in this order. You can always pause the video to work on your own introduction paragraph. So we will write them first with the thesis because that's the center point, the main point of our whole essay, and it needs to be solid. The rest of it doesn't matter if the thesis is weak, but we need to also know what we're going to get to. Then I usually write the background information, and the only reason I do that next is because oftentimes that's easier for kids to tackle because it's not as creative. It's really just summing up the main concept of the text and introducing it, and it's pretty easy to check that off the list. The hook or attention getter is probably the trickiest for most kids. It requires a little bit more creativity and thought, so I usually save that for the last so that kids don't just get stuck on the first sentence and don't get anything written. So that's the order I actually write them in when I'm thinking about it, but on the page, it would actually be flipped. For a literary analysis, the thesis is the main claim. Many teachers will refer to it as such. It is also sometimes called a theme statement because literary analysis arguments tend to argue a message related to a theme in the literature. So when formulating the thesis, you need to write a succinct and specific statement that addresses what the author is trying to argue in their story. Your teacher may have given you a prompt or main topic to work with just to get you started or focused. I often tell my students that authors argue things, they critique things, they support certain ideas, they push us to behave certain ways or view the world differently. So again, that's what we're looking for. Themes and authors' arguments should also be universal, meaning that anyone should be able to see how it functions not only within the context of the literature, but also how it applies to our world and our lives today. These concepts have deep meaning when done correctly. Also, don't forget that they should be debatable statements, something that we could disagree on or that we could have different interpretations. They should not be statements that are cliche or too vague. Cliche statements are things that are oversaid. You've probably heard them a million times. Vagueness has to do with just not being specific enough. You should be able to argue whether it is true and or that we can argue over the evidence to support it. Finally, literary analysis is about analyzing literature. In other words, you should be analyzing the writing choices in the text that support those conclusions you've made. However, listing the choices you will discuss in your paper is not typically required in a thesis unless your instructor tells you they must be. If you need more help with how to write the thesis statement, examples, and the difference between open and closed thesis statements, please consult my other video about writing a literary analysis thesis statement. So look at my example from Neil Gaiman's Clack the Rattlebag. In green, you will see my thesis statement. So you can pause it here if you want. You can read the whole paragraph, but the green is what I'm going to be focusing on because that's exactly what I would write first. So the white part of my thesis is a transition between the summary or background information and the main point of the thesis. You may or may not have this on the first draft of your introduction. However, I've also given a brief sneak peek into what writing choices I will focus on for my essay: dialogue, foreshadowing, and telling details. These are underlined so you can notice them. You don't always have to list the writing choices, but you should have at least some indication that the way the author wrote the text led you to the thematic idea. The green portion is my actual main claim, which captures the author's message and the story's theme. This is the core part of my essay, and everything from this point forward needs to relate to this idea. While this one is not the most debatable statement on its own merits, the argument will really come into play when I argue my reasons for this and the evidence I provide. However, note that it is universal. I can apply this to my life and the lives of those around me. Go ahead and pause it if you need to look at it closer. Now it's your turn. Go ahead and write your thesis statement. If you haven't already, make sure you get it down on paper. All right, so we're back to my example. Now we're going to work on the background information section. That's in the yellow. The background section, so here's a little bit about that. It's the section of your introduction that should set up what you are really writing about. So for a paper, let's say an argument about cleaning up trash in my community, I would need to establish the issue, why it's a problem, why it matters, its history, before I state my claim or my focus or my stance on it. Now, this is a literary analysis essay you're writing, but you still need to introduce your reader to the text you're analyzing. That's your background information. Did you include the title of the piece and who created it? Can you capture the essence of the work with a brief summary? Obviously, for a poem, you may not have character names or a plot to cover, but can't you summarize the basic the concept of the poem? For my example today, I'm using a short story and a couple of short stories throughout here, so I'll be focusing mostly on those required components. In the gold box is an example of what I give my 10th grade students to help them with their literary analysis essays on Of Mice and Men. It has the key information listed to help remind them of what they must include versus what they may include. The bolded items are required or things they must include, since those are the name of the book, the author, and the two main characters. The rest of those are just my tips of things that they might want to consider including. So let's go back to our example about Clack the Rattlebag. This is the section of background information I pulled from that complete introduction paragraph. Can you find the component parts? There's the text title. There's the author's full name. There's the main and relevant characters' names, and I'll probably include them in the body of my paper too and refer back to them. And then I have some summary that includes setting, main conflicts, and some key issues in the story. What's weird about my short story in particular is that neither of the main characters actually have a name, so I have to refer to them as narrator and the boy monster Click Clack. So that's one thing I want to point out that you understand is that typically I would have the names of characters, but my short story is unique. Now that we've looked at our core example, let's look at another one. This one comes from an analysis of a short story called The Cask of Amontillado by Edgar Allan Poe. This isn't the most sophisticated writing I've seen. Probably a more beginner writer would write something like this, and it could use some improvement, but it does have the component parts. Go ahead and pause and read this if you need it to just see another example of how to write an introduction. One question I often get is how much to include in the summary. I tell my students to write the summary as though someone read the book several years ago, or the text, whatever it is, and you were almost reminding them of the book's basic premise. See this example of mine from Of Mice and Men? It has the title, author's name, main character, setting, conflict, and plot. Are there areas where it could be improved or be more specific? Sure. I could go into who the woman is that he kills and how she relates to the context of the ranch. Also consider the other characters I did not include but play a pivotal role in the novella. Candy, Curly, Slim, Curly's wife, Crooks, the dog. There are so many directions I could go with this. At the end of the day, you need to think about what you already plan to put in your body paragraphs and mention the conflicts and characters you know you will include later in your essay. Note that I also included some example sentence starters you could use just to get you going with writing your background section. Remember, if you're writing about a short story, nonfiction book, poem, or play, just substitute that in for the word novel. So now it's your turn. Go ahead and turn to your writing and write your background information. Go ahead and pause the video so you can do that. And on the screen, I have some reminders of the types of things you would want to include in that background information section. Also, don't forget, the title of larger works like books and plays are in italics, while short stories, poems, smaller excerpts are in quotation marks. All right, so now we're moving on to the last part, which is actually the first part of our introduction. It's the very first thing that our readers will read. So what you need to remember is that a hook or attention getter is your chance to engage your audience and make them want to read your writing. Real-world writers have to think about this a lot because if people don't read past the introduction, the rest of your ideas will never be read or appreciated. So start off on the right foot with your audience by having a hook that gets them thinking, wondering, or curious about your ideas. You also don't want to have a hook that is too long. I once had a student who was a fantastic creative writer and loved to take her readers into a hypothetical scene. However, her hook ended up being over 1 page long. Even though it was really beautifully written, her peers and I read it and became a little annoyed and bored and just wanted her to get to the point. So I had to work with her on condensing. For this reason, I tell my students to try to keep your hook between 2 to 4 sentences. This also includes a transition between the hook and the background information. And don't forget, your hook also needs to be related to your actual thesis topic. It shouldn't be about the author separately. It shouldn't be about some tangent. It needs to really be about the ideas that you're exploring in your essay. All right, so there are lots of types of hooks out there. I've included the ones that are the most helpful for a literary analysis essay. So for example, some teachers suggest using a statistic for the hook, but for writing about literature, what would you even have as a statistic that relates to the literature you're analyzing? I think that one just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Can it work sometimes? Sure, but for literary analysis, I don't find it very helpful. So now on to the types of hooks I recommend. The first rule is that any and all hooks, like I said before, must relate to your thesis main topic. If it doesn't, then it will miss the mark and leave your reader confused. Trust me, I had a student who knew I loved Star Wars start with a Star Wars reference that had no connection to the essay, and it just really left me unimpressed. So first is the anecdote. Okay, this is a very short, often amusing or interesting story. It's typically about yourself, someone you know, or someone who is famous and you can successfully retell their story. It should still be really short. Again, remember, hooks are usually 2 to 4 sentences. Next is imagery. This is like the one I told you my student was doing. It's where you describe something related to your topic and you incorporate rich descriptions that are often related to one of the 5 senses. This is great for creative and poetic writers. Just make sure you don't go on and on with it. Oftentimes, you're trying to get your reader to step into someone else's point of view or into a scene or situation. Questions can be great for a hook, but please, please, please make sure your question is not answerable with a simple yes or no. Questions need to be thought-provoking, and questions that are answered with a simple yes or no don't really make me think. It's more of a knee-jerk reaction. It's just the simple answer. Questions that start with how, why, if, and when tend to work the best for this technique. Some students do really well starting with a broad question and following that up with more specific questions, and then even sometimes suggesting possible answers or thoughts about it. So an example of a bad question is, have you ever experienced tragedy? Well, that's a simple knee-jerk response. It's a yes or no. That question's not very thought-provoking, right? Whereas if I ask, when tragedy strikes, how do people cope with the onslaught of emotions that result? See how that question actually has a variety of answers because we'd each react differently, and it makes me as a reader think. I could then follow that question up with a statement about some common responses people would have to tragedy, or maybe even a different question that guides you further down the path of my thinking. All right, the 4th type of hook, startling statement. Be careful with this one. Sometimes students will write something that is startling but is not really connected to the topic, or so loosely connected that it just doesn't work. However, stating something controversial and related to your topic could get your reader interested in seeing what you have to say about it, especially if it contradicts the way most people think. Also remember that you usually need to follow up the startling statement with some transition. Maybe you explain how you feel about the idea or explain the complexities of the statement and why this controversy exists, or maybe it's a paradox that you've mentioned, so you need to address how this idea is actually valid. Finally, the infamous quotation. These can work beautifully if you, 1, pick a relevant quotation, 2, it can be understood out of its own context, or you explain the context by setting that up, 3, you know where it came from and who said it or wrote it. I once had a student quote a Nazi doctor who experimented on Jewish prisoners for their essay. It was unrelated to the topic and was not used to be ironic. They simply did not know his background and how his statement was contradicted by his actions, because they were actually writing about ethics and morals. So don't just go Google a quotation about your topic, because the internet is famous, and so is AI, for having misattributions of quotations. Some students are able to find a meaningful quotation from the text that they're analyzing in their paper. If you do this, make sure that that quotation does not need context to be understood. In other words, I don't need any introduction to the quotation. It's almost like a quote that could be on a poster or something. However, be mindful that with a quotation, you'll probably need to follow up a statement with some discussion of the relevancy or meaning behind the quotation or why it matters. In other words, your thoughts behind it. Please don't start with definition unless your teacher told you to. It is a type of hook that I see quite a bit. Often kids will quote Merriam-Webster's definition of something, and I personally find it pretty condescending to the reader as a first statement. It's almost like assuming that I am too dumb to understand a concept. However, definition may be used later in your essay if there are terms which are more subjective or have several connotative meanings. Then bringing up those definitions you have could be helpful. All right, now we're moving on to looking at our hook example. So in pink is our hook. This hook is actually an example of one technique I did not have on the previous slide. This is when you simply talk about a general understanding or concept. You're just kind of free writing about an idea in our world. This could be some of your experience, opinions, or just what you think most people would agree upon or with. It brings up the key topic in a broad general sense. And here's that other example from the Cask of Amontillado. For this introduction, the student actually used 2 techniques for their hook: the startling statement of murder, and then the follow-up question, is this a right way to get back at someone? Is this hook the most sophisticated? No. The question is answered with a yes or no, right? And I said that's not really that thought-provoking. But in this case, it could work because we were probably thinking most people would answer no. But if you read the transition to the short story in yellow, you can see that we bring up the yes response as it relates to the short story. But it does show some attempt at engagement and easing into the topic of revenge. All right, so here's your pause point. Go ahead and go write your attention getter a hook. If you're on your first draft, just get something out on paper that you think might work. Again, I have the top 5 that I like students to use in literary analysis on the screen to remind you. So go ahead and pause the video if you need to and write your hook or attention getter. So if you've done all the steps I told you so far, right now you have a rough introduction paragraph. It probably sounds a little choppy or chunky. It may be repetitive. It may jump from one point to the next. Now your job is to go back through your introduction and smooth it out by revising it. Look and see if you can combine sentences together. Go online and find lists of transitional words or phrases. There are tons of those out there on the internet. Try thinking about how your ideas are shifting or relate to each other and use an appropriate transition between them. In other words, make it flow. All right, one last time with my example paragraph. Underlined in this text are my transitions. These are phrases and words that lead between ideas and connect them together to help with the flow. The more advanced writer you are, probably the more naturally you already write with transitions. So go back and look at your introduction, see what you did with it, and make it worded in a way that everybody can follow how all the ideas interact. Thank you for watching my video about introductions for literary analysis essays. If you want to see more of my materials and videos, go ahead and go to my YouTube channel or my Teachers Pay Teachers page to check out my other resources.